Morning everybody, welcome back. Saturday shop day. We are going to work on the wiring on the Carl Speed Shop bike. It's really going to be a very simple wiring setup on here. This bike is absolutely bare bones. We've got headlight, taillight, brake light, ignition, charging system. I believe that is it. So it's going to be a relatively simple wiring job. I'll show you kind of how we do it. I like to, keep these things as minimal as possible. The only thing extra we are going to have to add is a relay, and that's only because of the on-off button we decided to use. It's a microscopic button that carries no real amp load, like 3 amps or something. So we'll use that to trigger a standard 30 amp relay for our on-off. Other than that, there is no extra wiring on this thing. So it'll be a pretty simple deal. We will kind of give you a little step-by-step on how to wire a Sportster. This is basically what would be a chopper wiring, same deal. Headlight, brake light, ignition, charging system, and nothing else. So that's it. I'm going to go grab some supplies and we're going to get to wiring. Alright, so first thing on the agenda is we need to ohm out our on-off switch. This switch has a feature where it would light up when you turn the switch on. We're not going to be using that, but because of that, there's multiple prongs on the back of the switch. Going to use a multimeter with our continuity setting and decide, or not really decide, but figure out which prongs we need for the on-off function of the switch to work. That switch, along with our momentary push-button switch, will both end up in our old handlebar riser holes. If you remember last week, those are the 2 bushings we made to hold the switches up in the triple trees for ease of access when you're sitting on the bike and wanting to get it started. After that, we're going to fire up the soldering iron here and go ahead and get some pigtails soldered onto these switches before installing them in the triple tree. You can see here I'm using a standard label printer that we've installed some heat shrink tubing in. Allows us to print labels to label our wires as we're going. Got a full complete video about that tool, as I find it to be really super handy. So if it's something if you're interested in, please check that out. It's on the channel, and I will try to remember to put a link in the description when I actually upload this. Once we get our pigtails soldered on, we're going to go ahead and get some mesh loom on them. This stuff is kind of like a Chinese finger trap if you're familiar with those from when you were a kid. It's not split or anything. You have to feed all the wires in from the end. Just a really clean wiring harness as far as I'm concerned. It's the best stuff out there, so that's what we use whenever we're wiring a bike. And then we just put a little piece of heat shrink on the end to lock it on and seal it off. Now that we got those switches finished up, we're going to go ahead, jump over to the other side and get the voltage regulator installed on the bike. Being it's a factory frame, the voltage regulator mounts right in the factory location. It's a simple 2 wires to the stator and 1 wire to the battery install, so nothing real unique about this. And it mounts right in between the frame rails. A couple bolts hold it on. And with that all set, we'll be right on to the next phase of the project, as this is very basic and nothing out of the ordinary. You can see that's resting in its final place. So we're going to jump up to the headlight, which is where most of our wiring will be done. The start button and the on-off switch wires are routed into the headlight bucket. Also going in the headlight bucket will be a headlight socket, as well as our main 30 amp relay, which will be used to feed power to everything on the bike. Once we get all that wiring finished up in the bucket, we went ahead and reinstalled our LED headlight bulb, and again used some of that mesh wire loom on the whole pigtail that was coming out of the back of the headlight bucket, which ends up being our battery feed wire, our main ground, our main on-off wire, as well as our starter button wire, which will get routed back to the starter. Next up was getting the ignition all set. We are running a standard old school Dyna S ignition with mechanical advancer. So out of that is just the 2 wires run up to the coil, and we'll add a switch power wire as well. So real simple ignition system, 2 wires coming out of the crank trigger, 1 wire from the bike harness, switch power, and that's it. Nothing else to it. All that goes to the coils, and that's your fully wired ignition system. You can see there the blue and yellow wire are the 2 wires from the crank trigger. So we got all our ignition wires routed. We're going to leave those unhooked at this moment because we still need to remove the coil mount for some paint work. So after that, we went ahead and got the battery dropped in. We're going to make up our ground cable. Use some nice solid copper 6-gauge cable and some crimp-on lug connectors. Again, this is nothing complex. We're doing this as simple as possible. So a couple crimp-on connectors, and we've got our battery cable, ground, which will run from the battery right over to what used to hold the old ignition box. We just had a hole there, so went ahead and sanded off a little bit of the paint, nice clean down to metal, and we'll connect our ground cable there once we get it finished. Last thing we had to do in this electronics area here was tie our taillight wires into our harness coming from the front of the bike. So again, very simple. We had a brake light, running light, and a ground wire. The ground wire is getting hooked up right in the same spot as the main ground cable from the battery, and the running light taillight wire got a switched power. The brake light wire, as well as a lead from the switch power lead, are going to drop down underneath the swing arm where the brake light switch is mounted in the brake line. Again, the theme of this thing, if you haven't caught on, is the absolute bare minimum we need to make this bike run. So, really super simple. If you remember from one of the previous videos, the tail lights were pre-wired. There was some tubing inside the fender, so we ran the wires through there, and it's been dangling, just waiting to get wired into the rest of the setup as we got moving. And here we're just go ahead and hook up our main battery power. It's a 4-gauge lead that runs down to the starter. Also on there is our main feed, which runs up to our 30 amp relay. It's a 16 gauge, which we did install an inline 30 amp fuse. So I guess we did put one thing we don't technically need. It would work without a fuse, but I have had a wiring harness burn up on a bike before from a stupid thing happening, and so I do try to always add a simple rubber housing 30 amp blade fuse to everything we do. Just can really save you a lot of heartache burning up a wiring harness you just installed on the bike. So finishing up over on this side, and we're back over on the starter side. You can see the blue wire dangling there. That's our starter lead signal wire coming from our push button start up at the handlebars. For some reason they decided to put these signal prong on these starters in the most irritating place in the world. Big twin starters have them right on top. Slide it on with a push-on connector. For some reason the Sportsters are underneath the starter where you can hardly get to it. Had to pull the sprocket cover back off. And then we were able to get in there with a pair of long needle nose pliers. Probably would have been easier had we done this before we put the chain and all on, but you know, things don't always go in the right order. So with that, it was time to do a little bit of testing on the electrical system. Ignition switch on. We got some tail lights. No brake lights yet, as the brake light switch isn't installed.
What you don't have on right now, so on fire.
I don't have the coils hooked up yet because I got to take that bracket off and paint it still.
Okay.
There we go. We got our headlights. We're cranking. Motor sounds very healthy. Can't wait to get this thing running and put a few miles on it.
Quick little overview of the bike. It's really coming together. Still got to shorten up those spark plug wires, but we're going to call it here for the day.
All right, guys, that's a wrap for today. Got all the wiring done. Last thing we have to button up on there is just our coil wires. Once we get our coils and our coil mount painted, we'll attach those, but all the lights are working, motor's cranking. So hopefully next week we'll be able to get this thing buttoned up, hook up brake lines, throttle cable, and be ready to get it down the test ride. Appreciate you guys following along, and we hope to see you next time at Gatti's Garage.